The rising cost of beach renourishment projects has really impacted many of our coastal areas in the past year. This year alone, we know at least 3 towns chose to postpone these projects because the bid came back higher, almost double in some cases, than what they thought it was going to be. WCT's Delaney Tarpley learned that because of those high price tags, many of these projects rely on some funding from the federal government. Now, Delaney, there are concerns that funding might be up in the air. Has funding for these renourishment projects been cut yet?
Well, no, not as of right now, Daniela, but a spokesperson I talked to with the Army Corps of Engineers says that things could change. This comes as many areas are already struggling to afford the cost of these projects. WECT learned in this past winter that Curie Beach, Carolina Beach, and Oak Island were postponing their beach renourishment projects. In Curie Beach, they thought $20 million would cover the project, but the bid came back almost double that at $37.5 million. In Oak Island and Carolina Beach, they also said all of the bids from the dredging companies were just way too high. Dave Connolly with the Army Corps of Engineers says there aren't enough dredging companies for the amount of projects, which is driving those bids up. Now, when we asked if they are on the lookout for any potential federal funding cuts, Connolly told us, quote, all of our current projects with federal funding we previously secured are still in the works. There are no immediate impacts. We will have to adapt and be flexible with whatever orders and new policies come down, end quote. We do know that Surf City and Bald Head Island have nourishment projects that are going on right now. Surf City's project is being paid for with state and local funding, and Bald Head Island is being partially paid for with federal funding. We have more details inside this story over on our website. Delaney Tarpley, WECT News.